down here and contribute what I can as an industrial hygienist to the solution of the problem of asbestos in Columbia. The title of my talk is Control of Installed Asbestos-Containing Materials. And subtitle, The Role of Responsible Organizations and Professionals. So this is kind of a bridge between today and tomorrow, because I'm going to be talking about the institutions and the people that make the science of asbestos control work. And I'm calling this an infrastructure. I'm not talking about a physical infrastructure of buildings and facilities. I'm talking about an infrastructure of people and the organizations that they work in. And these fall into a number of categories. You have the building owners, owners of this hotel, for example. We have buildings in the public and the private sectors. And then there are the professions and the trades that support the work of the building owners, their programs to control asbestos in their buildings, and this will include consultants, contractors, laboratories, and trainers. We also have the government agencies, the regulators, the research organizations, outreach, a number of different NGOs for labor, advocates, and also the standards organizations, organizations such as the one that is supporting my presence here, ASTM International, who write consensus standards for asbestos control. So what we're going to go through here is what do they do and how do they do it? In other words, what are their responsibilities and what resources do they bring to get the job done? So first of all, the building and facility owners. In one way, they're at the top of the pyramid. They're responsible for whatever happens in their buildings, the consequences of any asbestos exposure and hazards. One of the first things that I recommend to a building owner is always to establish an organizational balance. In other words, decide what you want to do with your own people and your own staff. Decide what is beyond those resources and what is better outsourced to other organizations and people. And to do this, of course, you have to have information on asbestos in your buildings provided to your staff and others who will work with it. So, obviously, one of the first things you do in this program is to identify the materials in the building, find out what is there, how much is there, where it is. And this gives you information to control the hazards that might arise from exposing people to the fibers from those activities based on what they do in the buildings. And this has to be done in compliance with the regulations and contracts that are enforced for the buildings. So to do this, what a capable and competent building owner has to do is, first of all, have the authority of his own organization to provide the manpower and the funding to get the work done. The staff that will be doing the work has to be trained in the fundamentals of asbestos control, how to work with it or how to recognize it. And in most cases, the work is going to be divided between the in-house staff and outside professionals. So let's look at what some of these professionals do and who they are. Okay? We have the professional asbestos consultant. I've been doing asbestos consulting now for over 35 years. There are a number of us in the U.S. and around the world who specialize in this particular area of consulting. The first thing we need to do is to establish a consultant-client relationship. Asbestos consulting is no different from working with an architect or an engineer. There has to be a contractual relationship, a formal, cordial relationship between the building owner and the asbestos consultant. So having that in place, the consultant assists the building owner in implementing an asbestos control program. In other words, the consultant is not part of the staff. The consultant doesn't have organizational authority to do what needs to be done in the building. He has to advise the building owner what needs to be done and bring in the proper resources to get it done. In other words, he has to help manage the work. So one of the first things, a very important thing that the consultant does is to identify the asbestos materials in the building, and this is done by taking samples of we call it suspect material. In other words, if you have reason to believe the material contains asbestos, you take a bulk sample of it, you send it to a laboratory, and you have it analyzed. There's asbestos. You go through an assessment process to find out what are the relative degrees of risk associated with that material, and from that, you prioritize your controls. One thing that I need to emphasize right now is you don't just go in and remove all of the asbestos right away. You prioritize. A lot of it can stay in place if it's managed properly and handled properly. Some of it should come out fairly soon. You need to decide that based on your analysis and based on your assessment. Of course, the consultant documents findings and reports that are gone over with the client and kept for reference. So when work is done on actual control activities, whether they are small or large in scope, the consultant acts as the on-site representative of the building owner. And here again, he is not directing the work of a contractor. That's the supervisor's responsibility. The consultant is there to make sure that the contractual requirements are followed and to communicate with the contractor to make sure that things are done according to those requirements and according to regulations. Now, as consultants, we work very closely with the government regulatory agencies. In fact, we work with them while they are developing the regulations. They come to us for our input because we're out there in the field working with it every day as to what those regulations should be and how they should come together. So we have that relationship with the regulatory agencies that we can use to the building owner's benefit. We either have our own laboratories or we work with other laboratories, so we are very experienced and knowledgeable in the analytical methods for asbestos. So that is something else that we can advise the building owner on what type of analyses are needed and work with the laboratories to make sure that the analyses meet the needs of what is being sampled. And a very important part, employee community. You know, asbestos is a very emotional subject. It's very sensitive, and it's a difficult subject to talk to people about in a rational manner. But this is something that we've had experience in. Building owners, or I should say employees, may be very touchy about even being in a building with asbestos, let alone having to physically work with it. So the consultant can kind of smooth those waters as far as when the emotional issues come up about asbestos, whether it's with employees or whether it's with the community or with the media. So that is a very important service that a consultant should provide. Now, to do this, we have to have a wide range of skills, our academic and professional qualifications in the physical sciences and also the health sciences. My background is I'm an engineer, an aeronautical engineer, which doesn't really help a lot in buildings, but I've learned buildings on the job. But I'm also a certified industrial hygienist with a Master of Public Health degree, so that is my health professional qualifications. In the physical sciences, you're going to find geologists very active because they are the ones who are very knowledgeable about asbestos as a mineral. So the training that we get, though, we don't get the training for this in the academic setting. The training we get is provided through continuing education. Universities, other training providers provide this outside their academic setting. We go through courses that are formally defined, well-structured in the needs, complying with the regulations and what the procedures are. So we have to know about inspecting buildings. So we'll take courses, go out into buildings, look at materials. It might be asbestos, look at a roof, look at a ceiling. We have to know the abatement procedures, so we need to know something about construction. Operations and maintenance, you're going to hear that term frequently because shortened to O&M, that means working with small amounts of material for a short duration. There's a lot of that. And then when you get to actually removing the asbestos, we call that an abatement project that has to be designed just as you would design the renovation or the construction of a building. So we go through that process, and then when the work starts, we are there on site as the building owner's representative to make sure that the work is carried out according to the contract. And of course, we also provide air monitoring during that. So we need to know building systems, we need to know construction methods, we need to know how they're operated, how are different materials used, renovation methods, and nothing is more important than actual field experience out on a construction site, specifically at an asbestos abatement site. And finally, going back again to our written and verbal communication skills, to communicate with the workforce, communicate with building occupants, and with other entities such as the community and media, if it comes to that. So then we have the laboratories. They specialize in, among other things, in some laboratories, specifically in asbestos analysis. And their job is simply to analyze the samples that consultants, contractors, and building owners take. Now, we have two categories of samples. Bulk samples of the materials themselves to find out if they contain asbestos, and if so, what type of fiber, and what is the content percent. Also air samples for airborne asbestos fiber levels, particularly during an asbestos abatement project. And the job of the laboratory is actually very narrowly defined. It is to provide the results of their analysis according to the method that they've been told to use or they've chosen to use. Now, here is an important point that I think we may have a bit of a deficiency, or let's say needs work in Columbia. This has to be done on a commercial basis. You can't make the analysis of an asbestos sample a research project. You take a sample of the material, you need to know within a day or two whether it contains asbestos. You're taking air samples to find out whether you can clear the building for reoccupancy. You need those samples the same day or the next day. This has to be done with a fast turnaround. It has to be done at low cost. Now, in the United States, I can remember 30 years ago when to get fast turnaround, it cost a lot of money. We were taking $500 for an electron microscope air sample to be analyzed. Today, it is around $50. So it can be done, it takes time, but this is something that I'm saying part of the infrastructure. It's here in Columbia, whether it's in your universities or commercial laboratories, something to build on, but this is an important requirement in the laboratory resources. It is not the job of the laboratory to interpret the results in terms of exposure or health effects of breathing the fibers. So the laboratory personnel have training primarily in geology, and they've taken additional training courses in the analytical methods that they will use. Adequate equipment speaks for itself, the proper microscopes and all the support equipment that go along with running a laboratory. There are a number of associations and government agencies that accredit laboratories, that run proficiency programs, sample exchanges, they inspect the laboratories. It is important to get into those accreditation and proficiency programs for an asbestos laboratory. And now we get to the people who actually put their hands on asbestos, the contractors. And here again, just like with the architects and engineers, you have that base in Columbia. You have the base of all of these disciplines here in Columbia. What needs to be done is to extend those resources and capabilities to deal with asbestos. So your contractors, you have contractors here in all the various trades, general contractors and the trades. What they do is they perform small work, we're calling the operations and maintenance, and they do the actual removal. And you're seeing here a couple of pictures taken at asbestos abatement sites. They follow the regulations and the contractual requirements. None of this should be done by word of mouth and a handshake. It has to be done with a written contract. Whether it's the O&M procedures, abatement specifications are followed. Those are prepared by the project designer, who is the consultant, who also provides oversight. The reason I have these pictures is because I was on site as the owner's representative, observing what the contractors were doing. So an important part of this, going beyond just general construction, they have to provide all of the construction-related precautions, health and safety precautions to the workers that they would at any construction site. But they have to go beyond that to provide the precautions that have to do with asbestos exposure. So these will be trained and experienced workers and supervisors are getting their experience in the construction trades. The organization has to have credentials that may require licensing. Also important is then the experience in construction and specifically asbestos contracting, O&M, and removal. Adequate facilities, all of the equipment. There's a lot of equipment that goes into removing or maintaining asbestos. That has to be all provided, maintained in good condition. You want an asbestos contractor who is stable and solvent. You don't want one that is on the brink of bankruptcy and cannot afford to bring either the manpower or the equipment to the site to get the job done. And also there should be no organizational conflict, no connection between the contractor and the consultant or the laboratory. You have to have a firewall between those various disciplines. Now, as far as training goes, this is also becoming a rather specialized field in the U.S. and elsewhere. These are trainers that provide the continuing education courses. If they don't work within the academic programs, they may work for a university, but it is a separate continuing education component. So they need, obviously, their basic instruction on training and skills. What this will include is lectures, like in an ordinary classroom, but also going out with hands-on exercises. And by hands-on exercise, we mean training somebody to do work on a non-asbestos material that simulates it. For example, asbestos cement. I found a product, it's called Hardy Board. It doesn't contain asbestos, but you drill into it and it produces dust. So it's a good simulator for asbestos cement. Same thing with floor tile. I can simulate and train people on floor tile with non-asbestos floor tile. It's the same procedure. Reference materials in the form of a notebook or a CD or now flash drives. So that's an information resource. Documentation. What I'm talking about there is a certificate of attendance that has the name of the training provider, the name of the attendee, describes the course and the date, when it expires. There's a problem in the U.S. with these certificates being forged and either sold or used to get a job or a license. In other words, there is training certificate fraud. That is a big problem in the U.S. People have been sent to jail for it, as a matter of fact. So it's very important. You see a training certificate, verify it with the training provider. Did this person really take this course in this date at your institution? So the training providers, their resources, they have an academic degree in physical or health sciences. They've taken the training courses that they're giving. They have the work experience. They have the knowledge of all the practices, and have to be, of course, have proficiency in the instructional methods. And as we're going forward into the digital age, experience and knowledge of the digital e-training learning is also becoming more important. Okay, now let's talk about your government agencies. They're an important component of this. They write the regulations that we, as the professionals and building owners, training providers, have to follow. So they respond to the statutory mandates that your legislature sets, and also looking at the intent of those statutes. They should participate with the regulated and affected communities in developing these regulations and disseminating the information. Now, by the regulated community, I mean people like myself, that I have to follow certain regulations in the United States and in the state of Texas. If I don't, I'm subject to a sanction, possible penalties for not doing that. The same goes for the contractors and people in other disciplines. So I am bound by those regulations. I do benefit from them. They help protect my health, and they help me protect other people's health. Also, we have what I'm calling the affected community, people who don't work with asbestos in any way, shape, or form, but they are the ones that ultimately are being protected here. They're the general public, they're the occupants of buildings, their families, NGOs. So they are the affected community that benefits from the regulations and the enforcement. So enforcement is extremely important. If the agency doesn't have people out there at the job sites or in buildings enforcing the regulations, they're not getting their job done. And if a ban on asbestos is ever enacted, and I hope it does soon in Colombia, they will enforce that ban on asbestos imports. So here again, just like the building owner, they need their institutional authority to give them the manpower and funding to do the job, and they need to train their staff in doing this work. Okay. So now that we've introduced the topic of asbestos bans, it's been talked about today. So what is banned? Production, importation, and use of asbestos fiber and the products. Well, I've heard various numbers mentioned as high as 60. My last count is 47. This includes Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. And I will have the pleasure of going to Santiago next week to address a conference in Chile, much of the same subject. So what will happen if you do ban asbestos? Well, new products will cease. You won't be making any more products or installing them. But the products installed over previous decades, they're still in the buildings. They've been there for decades. They will be there for decades in the future. So what are you going to do about that? Now, I'm an industrial hygienist. I'm not a physician, but just one slide on health effects. They cause respiratory diseases. See, the fibers cause respiratory diseases, lung cancer, the tumor in the lung, mesothelioma. I don't know if you thought about this, but if you break that word down, literally it means cancer of the lining of the middle of the body. It's a very descriptive term. And then asbestosis, the scarring of the lungs in the alveoli. The World Health Organization tells us that these diseases and others cause over 100,000 deaths worldwide per year. So these deaths, this exposure comes, well, the diseases come from exposure. The exposure comes from starting back at the mine, extracting the rock and then extracting the fibers from the rock, packaging it, shipping the fibers to the plants around the world. I've been to two asbestos mines in Canada. I've seen the mining and milling operation. The two on the right were taken in India. So we have people there actually handling the fibers, handling the asbestos sheets that they're putting on the truck or piling up here. So what causes exposure? Disturbance causes exposure. Disturbance means when you disturb the matrix and release the fibers. And this can happen from a number of causes that you see listed here. And it goes all the way from installation to final disposal. These pictures were taken on Sunday. I had the opportunity to go through the National University, looked at a number of asbestos roofs, and also saw a set of asbestos cement tanks on top of one building, giving me the start of an overview of asbestos use in Colombia. So the question is, how much installed asbestos products remains in buildings in Colombia? I did some research. The data from the U.S. and British geological surveys into their databases, and going back to 1970, was able to determine that between 1970 and 2008, Colombia produced in the country from their mines 166,000 tons of fiber. And since then, since they stopped mining it, they have, well, since 1970, there's some more left, they have imported 730,000. So that is almost 900,000 tons of asbestos fiber. That does not include the fiber that was mined or introduced before that time. But all of this fiber, close to 1 million tons, was mixed with other materials, chiefly cement. So if you look at the average ratio of asbestos fiber to cement, you come up with about a 25% asbestos content. So for every ton of fiber, you have 4 tons of asbestos-containing product. Again, this is just since 1970. So what happened to that more than 3.5 million tons of asbestos products? Some has been removed, some was probably reused, some went to landfills, and at the landfills, some of it may have been scavenged and reused. The person on the right in the blue, that sack that he's holding, says LAB. That is the sack, the bag that the fiber came in from the mine and the mill in Canada. I believe that picture was taken in Indonesia. But most of it remains in the buildings where it was installed, and that is what we need to talk about dealing with. So there are categories of asbestos products. First of all, I'm going to break it down this way in the U.S. We call, first of all, surfacing materials. These are materials that are sprayed on architectural and structural surfaces, steel surfaces, ceilings. Thermal insulation, its purpose is to control the flow of heat into and out of components like pipes and flues. The larger category of miscellaneous materials that doesn't include, or that doesn't fit the other categories, anything from floor tile and mastic to ceiling tiles, wallboard joint compound, and of course asbestos cement products. So what I want to do here is talk about some of the myths and the facts of asbestos cement, because there are a lot of myths out there, and I would like to debunk them with some of the facts. The first myth is that the fibers are locked in the cement matrix and they can't be released from the surface. And what you're looking at on the left is chrysotile fibers laying on the surface of a roof that has been deteriorated from weathering. Over on the right, this is a asbestos cement pipe that I was able to examine at close range. It is deteriorated from weathering, and it is broken. And if you were to look closely, I don't think you can, how close you can see it on the screen, but the white fibers that are sticking out are chrysotile. There are a couple of blue ones that are crucibolite. So they don't remain locked in the surface or in the material. They come out of the factory that way, but after a short period of time, they can be released. Any kind of deterioration or damage. And then we have the fact that it is considered non-friable. And the reason for that is you cannot coat the powder by hand pressure. And because it's non-friable, then by extension they say that it cannot release fibers. This is, again, a falsity, because any non-friable material, given enough deterioration or damage, becomes friable. Now, I'm going to try to attempt through a video here. Okay, let me dispense with the video anyway. What happens in this is that I take that piece of cement and I crush it in my hand. You see powder and debris falling off. Close enough. Okay, take my word for it. Okay. So now we get to this concept of safe use of asbestos or controlled use. And the myth is that it can be handled without presenting a hazard to anyone, because the industries have developed methods to control exposure to, quote, acceptable levels. And you'll find statements like this. Refer to the safe use of chrysotile asbestos, and they refer to a manual from the Chrysotile Institute. In other words, the trade association that represents the factories and the companies that make asbestos fibers and products. And if you get the manual, look at it online, it says the right things. It says use respirators, use wet methods, ventilation, all the control methods. That's all good information. People should do that. The problem is that they don't, because this information doesn't get to the worker who actually is handling material. They don't receive the training. They don't receive the equipment they need. They don't get to have the filtered vacuum cleaners to use. So they have no way to follow the provisions. They haven't even been told what's in the manual. If the employer has the manual, it's probably sitting on the shelf. Nor do the employers or government agencies provide any monitoring of the workers or oversight of the operations to see if they're complying with what's in the manual. So I guess what I'm saying is that manual, as far as protecting workers go, is totally worthless. And as far as an acceptable level of exposure, the only acceptable level is 0. So now I'm going to introduce an organization and the standards briefly that I'm going to be talking about in the workshop on Friday. ASTM International was formerly known as the American Society for Testing and Materials. It was founded way back in 1898. It's a very large organization, about 40,000 members. They produced over probably about 15,000 standards, 140 committees. They're the world's largest producer of consensus standards. They're developed by the members themselves, people like myself. Rigorous spelling process is not an easy or a quick process to develop a standard and get it published. ASTM is not a government agency. The voting is by individual members. We have government people in government who are members of ASTM, but they participate just like any other member would. ASTM has memorandums of understanding with over 100 countries, including with the ICONTACT organization here in Colombia. So there are 2 publications to become familiar with in this field. The various standards on asbestos control and laboratory standards are in this online publication on the green cover. You can download it in PDF form, and getting it as a compilation like this is a lot cheaper than if you buy the standards individually, so I would recommend that. The manual on asbestos control, I'm the author of all 3 editions, including the 3rd edition with 3 co-authors, and the manual describes all of the standards, most of them, that are in the compilation, about which I will talk on Friday. I'm not going to go through this chart in detail. You can see the various topics, and what you do is you go through what I call the holistic approach. You start with a building survey, find out what's in the building for sampling and analysis, do an assessment to prioritize, and then having found your asbestos, you decide which you're going to manage in place and which you're going to remove, what your priorities are. There are standards for asbestos cement specifically, and there are supporting technologies and, of course, some specialized analyses and sampling that we also look at. So looking at the applications, the standard for asbestos cement, the E2394, this is, excuse me, where removal is not feasible, but disturbance is unavoidable. In other words, this individual has to drill holes in the asbestos siding, so his control method is to wet the siding to cut down the fiber release. So you use hand tools, and you prohibit the reuse of discarded materials. The other standard that goes along with this, the E1368 visual inspection standard, that is actually a little bit of a misnomer. It is actually broader in scope than that, because it is really a management tool for the abatement project to improve the chances of passing the inspections and clearance or sampling. So it has the procedures and criteria for the inspections, 3 inspections that are talked about. When it comes to removing asbestos, talking about asbestos cement removal, first of all, if you're going to be demolishing a building, remove the asbestos cement panels or siding. Remove them first. Don't do what is being done in the lower right, which is knocking the building down, or with those panels in place. If you have large sheets of material, you'll need some mechanical handling equipment. The workers on the left are removing the small asbestos siding, so that can be done by hand. All 3 of these standards apply to one degree or another to removing asbestos cement. Now, you still have plants operating here in Columbia, making asbestos cement products. You may have some that have stopped operating, so this gets us to the problem of decommissioning and decontaminating these plants. 20 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit a plant in northern Israel that made pipe and corrugated flat sheet. The time I visited, they had stopped using asbestos about a year before that. They were kind of in a phase-down project. So here's the interior of the plant. On the left, they did have some controls. For example, that blue bag opener was closed and ventilated. And you see that little sign that says to wear a respirator. But then I went out into the plant, the area where they had the dust collection equipment. And they had this tubing going around the plant, and they had a vacuum system. There was dust on this orange machinery that had been there for a year or more. They took samples of that dust, and the dust contained chrysotile and amosite fiber that had been there for a year, that had leaked out of the dust collection system. So, and outside the plant, they had support facilities like, well, first of all, the plant was located at the top of a rise that led down to a beach on the Mediterranean. So their waste would flow down across that land, across the beach and into the Mediterranean. They had bag houses and crushers and slurry ponds and all that, all of which were producing some degree of asbestos contamination. So, to summarize this, the human infrastructure requirements, the people, the organizations, need professional support and government interaction. Well, they include those components: professional support and government interaction. You need a holistic approach. You have to put all the pieces together, let them work together to control asbestos. And these are embodied in the ASTM standards that I'll talk about on Friday. And very important, You need the commitment and the participation of the participants. You can't pay lip service to asbestos and solve its problems. Thank you for attending.
Vamos a pasar a la serie de preguntas, por favor, para finalizar. ¿Alguien tiene una cuestión? Para el doctor Oberta, ¿hay alguna pregunta? Para el doctor.
Sí. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Mi nombre es Juan Pablo Ramos de la Universidad de los Andes. She's not translating.
Sí, sí. I think we have translate. Now I can hear you.
Muchas gracias por la presentación. Solamente quiero hacer énfasis en algo que usted mencionó, que estoy totalmente de acuerdo, pero creo que es muy importante que seamos conscientes de eso en Colombia. Si eventualmente prohibimos que el asbesto, que es una cosa que es todavía muy incierta por todos los intereses económicos y políticos que hay detrás de esto, usted mencionó algo que es muy importante que estamos conscientes, y es que la prohibición es el inicio de la solución, no es la solución al problema de los asbestos. Usted nos mostró unas cifras de la cantidad de asbestos que ha utilizado en Colombia, muy interesante. Las cifras que maneja la industria del asbesto, las cifras que ellos han sacado en comunicaciones, es algo que debemos tener en cuenta para dimensionar la magnitud del problema que se ha generado en Colombia. Ellos hablan de que hay asbestos en productos de construcción en 5 millones de casas en Colombia. La cantidad de tejas de asbesto que se han distribuido en el país es aproximadamente, de acuerdo con las cifras de ellos, 300 millones de metros cuadrados. Eso es suficiente para cubrir con un techo toda Bogotá. Eso es en los últimos 65 años. Hay más de 3 millones de vehículos de pasajeros que están circulando en Colombia en este momento con vehículos de freno, con productos de freno que contienen asbesto. Y esta cifra son cifras entregadas por ellos, que es un problema de una magnitud que, como usted bien dijo, lo que tenemos que enfrentar es un problema multigeneracional. O sea, esto no va a ser solucionado por esta generación, no va a ser solucionado por la siguiente generación, y seguramente vamos a tener que esperar 2 o 3 generaciones para poderlo solucionar. Y yo creo que eso es algo que tenemos que ser muy conscientes, porque la prohibición es solamente el
are just the tip of the iceberg. And you're right, it is a decades, generational problem. What the ban is going to do is workers in the factories will no longer be exposed. Okay, the installers of new products will be exposed, but all those tons, millions of tons that you talked about, that I was only aware of part of it, it's out there. I think when you say generations, I think you're probably right.
Tenemos una serie de preguntas empezadas. En este momento vamos a hacerlo en este orden. Doctor Oberta, doctor Frank y doctora Rojas. Para el doctor Oberta, ¿tienen preguntas? Doctor Oberta. Sí.
Talking about disposing of asbestos product, or are you talking about disposing of asbestos materials that your buildings are made of, like roofing and siding?
Participado. Estoy hablando de materiales que contienen asbesto, es decir,
About construction materials, I just want to make sure of that. The only way to dispose of those is to bury them. There are some conversion technologies that are being used in Europe. Obviously, it's very expensive, and I don't think you'd want to send your products all that far, but burial is really the only way that you can do it. It has to be wrapped in secure containers, and at least plastic. If you can put it, sheet products are not that amenable to putting in a round drum, though I recommend that. Anything that will fit in a rigid container, like a round drum, or if you're disposing of pipes, put the small pipes inside of the large pipes. The idea is to seal it in plastic at least, and bury it. Put it under, I would say, a meter of clean fill, and halfway through that, put an impermeable membrane so people can't dig through it, because there is an urge to dig this material up and reuse it. I'm sure there's a market for scavenged asbestos products. So that is really the only solution, whether it is product, meaning the product that went out of the factory that was made there, or whether it's the construction material that the building was made from. I don't see any alternative to wrapping it securely and burying it under at least a meter of clean soil. And of course, managing that landfill properly to make sure that nobody can get to it and disturb it. It's not an easy solution, it's not cheap, but I don't see any alternative.
Buenas tardes. Pues quería hacer un comentario final.
That there is really mine operating in Colombia. And yes, if they should, of course, be protected by proper controls. A mine is a very difficult place to control the exposure. You have the explosive removal of blasting from the rock. So one would really have to look at the operations and see what controls it has and see what controls it needs. It's like the Crisis File Institute said, that it is possible to say, for the safety didn't follow these precautions. They may be aware of those, they probably don't follow them. So, yeah, I guess your question is, am I concerned, and what would I recommend? What I would recommend is an industrial hygiene survey of the mine by the cognizant authorities or by qualified professional individuals in the country, and determine what has to be done at each stage of production within that mine, from the actual extraction from the rock all the way to the packaging in the bags in the warehouse. So it's a complicated process. I've seen it done. It's not an easy job.
El doctor Frank quiere complementar la pregunta.
I have a much more simple answer for the question. I think it is morally indefensible to continue to mine asbestos.
I agree.
El doctor Oberta está de acuerdo con esa respuesta. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta para el doctor?